My fiancé canceled our wedding to test my love, so I let him walk away. My name is Felix. I am 28 years old, and when my fiancé canceled our wedding 3 days before the ceremony to test my love, I didn't fight for her. I let her go and watched her world crumble in the rearview mirror. The silence in the apartment was heavy, the kind that presses against your eardrums and makes your own breathing sound like thunder. 3 days. That was all that remained on the countdown calendar sitting on the kitchen island. The one with the cute little hearts drawn in red marker for every Saturday we had spent planning this union. Now, it felt like a prop from a play that had been abruptly canceled. I stood there, staring at the granite countertop, my phone resting screen down beside a half-empty cup of coffee that had long gone cold. The vibration of the device minutes ago had shattered the calm of my Sunday morning, bringing with it a text message that had, in a matter of seconds, dismantled the entire life I had spent 3 years building. Her name was Sophie, and for the last 3 years, she had been the axis around which my world rotated. We had met at a friend's barbecue. A chance encounter that felt written in the stars, or at least, that was what I had told myself. We bought a condo together 6 months ago. We had picked out paint colors, argued over thermostat settings, and merged our lives into a comfortable, predictable rhythm. We were supposed to get married on Saturday. 200 guests were flying in from all over the country. A deposit of $30,000 was resting in the venue's bank account. And now, a single text message had thrown a wrench into the gears with such force that the machine was threatening to break apart. The message had been short, cruel in its brevity, and baffling in its content. She said she couldn't go through with it. She said she needed to know if what we had was real. She called off the wedding because she felt I had become complacent, taking her presence in my life for granted. She said she needed space to see if I would fight for her, to see if I would come crawling on my hands and knees to prove that my devotion was absolute. It was a test, a maturity-destroying, manipulative, high-stakes game of chicken played with the sanctity of our future. Most people in my position would have panicked. They would have immediately dialed her number, shouting, pleading, demanding an explanation. They would have jumped in the car and sped to wherever she was hiding, ready to promise her the moon and the stars just to keep the schedule intact. I didn't do any of those things. Instead, I felt a strange, cold clarity wash over me. I looked around the condo. It was filled with boxes marked honeymoon and new apartment. It was filled with the remnants of a dream we had built together. But as I stood there, reading the text over and over again, I realized something profound. The woman I loved, the woman I thought I was going to marry, wouldn't do this. The person who sent a text 3 days before a wedding to test someone's love wasn't a partner. She was a project manager of chaos. I picked up the phone and typed out a response. It wasn't a plea. It wasn't a desperate attempt to win her back. It was a simple acknowledgement of her decision. I told her that if she had doubts this monumental, then canceling was the right thing to do. I told her I respected her decision and that I would handle the logistics of notifying the guests and the vendors. I hit send, and the moment the message delivered, the air in the room changed. The pressure in my chest didn't vanish, but the chaotic panic that usually accompanies heartbreak was replaced by a grim, steely resolve. I wasn't going to play this game. I wasn't going to jump through hoops to prove my worth to someone who thought it was acceptable to gamble with the feelings of 200 people and the sanctity of our commitment. I put the phone down, picked up my cold coffee, and walked to the sink. As I poured the black liquid down the drain, I watched it swirl and disappear, feeling a terrifying sense of freedom. The wedding was off, and for the first time in 3 years, I was entirely on my own. The next 24 hours were a blur of administrative logistics that felt more like organizing a funeral than a wedding. People often talk about the emotional devastation of a breakup, the crying and the wallowing, but there's a distinct, soul-crushing horror in the bureaucracy of ending a marriage that never began. I sat at the dining room table with a spreadsheet open on my laptop, a bottle of water, and a phone that wouldn't stop ringing. The spreadsheet listed every vendor: the florist, the photographer, the band, the caterer, the venue coordinator. Next to each name was a column for the deposit paid, the cancellation policy, and the likelihood of getting a refund. It was a brutal lesson in the economics of love. I started with the hardest calls first. The The venue was non-refundable. $30,000, gone in an instant because of a test. It hurt physically to hear the manager's voice, confused and sympathetic, explaining that the contract was clear. I moved on to the caterer. They were willing to pivot the food to a different event, but the retainers were lost. The photographer, a kind woman with a soft voice, asked if there had been a death in the family. I didn't know how to answer that. I simply said there had been a change of plans. Word began to spread before I could even get to the guest list. Social media is a hydra. Cut off one head of information, and two more grow in its place. My mother called, her voice shrill with panic, asking what I had done. My friends texted in a group chat, demanding to know if this was a prank. Throughout it all, I remained silent about the why. I didn't tell them that Sophie had canceled to see if I would fight for her. I didn't want to humiliate her, despite what she had done to me. I simply told everyone the wedding was off, citing irreconcilable differences a week before the vows. It was a phrase that sounded so small for the chasm that had opened up in my life. The silence from Sophie was deafening. I expected her to reach out, to panic when she didn't receive the desperate text barrage she was clearly anticipating. I checked my phone constantly, not because I missed her, but because I was monitoring the enemy. Nothing. No, I didn't mean it. No. Are you really calling the caterer? Just radio silence. By the second evening, the adrenaline of the cancellations began to fade, replaced by a profound exhaustion. I looked around the condo. The remnants of our life together were everywhere. Her toothbrush was still in the holder, pink and next to my blue one. Her coat was draped over the armchair where she had thrown it 3 nights ago after complaining about the air conditioning. The sheer volume of evidence of her existence was overwhelming. It was in the scented candles on the coffee table, the throw pillow she had insisted on buying that I found uncomfortable, and the sheer curtains that let in too much light for my liking but made her happy. I realized then that I couldn't stay here. This space wasn't just a physical location. It was a monument to a relationship that had been a lie. If I stayed, surrounded by her things and her ghost, I would eventually break. I would eventually cave. I would pick up the phone and ask her to come back, just to stop the silence. But looking at the spreadsheet with the thousands of dollars lost, the anger returned. This wasn't just a cold feet scenario. This was financial and emotional vandalism. I decided then and there that I would move out. I would let her have the condo, the furniture, and the life we built. I would take my clothes, my books, and my laptop, and I would disappear. It was the only way to pass the test with any dignity. I wasn't going to fight for her. I was going to fight for my future, a future that suddenly looked very different than it had 48 hours prior. Packing your life into cardboard boxes is a strange ritual. It forces you to hold objects that define you and decide if they are worth the weight of carrying them. I started in the bedroom, the epicenter of our shared existence. I took the suit I was going to wear on Saturday out of the garment bag. I looked at it for a long time, admiring the charcoal fabric and the crisp white shirt that hung beneath it. It was a suit meant for a beginning, a celebration. Now, it felt like a costume for a play that had been canceled during intermission. I folded it neatly and placed it in a box labeled clothes, feeling a sense of finality that settled in the pit of my stomach like a stone. Sophie still hadn't returned. I knew where she was, likely at her best friend's apartment, sitting around with wine, complaining that I wasn't chasing her, validating her own insecurities by spinning a narrative where I was the villain for not fighting for her love. She expected anger. She expected drama. She expected me to storm over there and demand to know why she was throwing away 3 years. Instead, I was silently erasing myself from our home. I methodically packed my bookshelf, removing the titles I loved and leaving behind the coffee table books she had bought for aesthetic purposes. I packed the vinyl records, carefully sliding them into sleeves. I packed the photos of us, not because I want to keep them, but because I couldn't bear to leave them for her to find later. They went into a box that I knew would end up in the back of a closet, unopened for years. On the 3rd day, as the apartment began to echo with the hollow sound of emptiness, the lock clicked. The front door swung open, and Sophie walked in. She looked disheveled, her eyes red and puffy, but there was a certain expectation in her posture. She was dressed in sweatpants and a hoodie, looking like she had prepared for a battle of wills. She stopped in the entryway, her eyes scanning the living room. The sight of the stacks of boxes against the wall threw her off balance. She looked from the boxes to me, where I sat on the floor, taping up a box labeled kitchen. She didn't speak at first, but the air in the room shifted instantly. The silence I had been living in for days was replaced by a tangible tension. She took a step forward, her eyes narrowing as she processed what was happening. This wasn't the scene she had rehearsed in her head. She had pictured me on the couch, heartbroken, waiting for her return. She had pictured a groveling apology from her, followed by a tearful reunion. Instead, she was confronted with the reality of a man who was leaving. She looked around the room, noticing the missing pictures, the gaps on the shelves, the sheer absence of her presence in the space. It was as if I had already ghosted the relationship. I stood up, brushing the dust from my jeans. I didn't look at her with anger. I didn't look at her with love. I looked at her with the indifference one might reserve for a stranger. That indifference was more painful to her than any scream could ever be. She stood there, trembling slightly, waiting for me to say something, to break the silence, to give her the opening she needed to start the fight. But I simply picked up the tape gun and walked to the next room. I could feel her gaze burning into my back, a mix of confusion and rising panic. She realized then that her test had backfired. She had pushed me to see how far I would bend, only to find out that I didn't bend at all. I broke. And now, she was the one holding the pieces. The atmosphere in the apartment was suffocating, a thick cloud of unspoken words and failed manipulations. I continued to pack, moving from room to room with a robotic efficiency, ignoring the figure that followed me from a distance. Sophie was hovering, oscillating between shock and a growing, frantic anger. She couldn't understand it. In her mind, her canceling the wedding was a cry for attention, a theatrical gesture designed to shake me out of my complacency. She believed that our love was a story that always ended with us together, regardless of the obstacles. She underestimated the sheer finality of respect. She didn't understand that by pulling the plug, she hadn't just paused the movie. She had taken the disc out of the player and snapped it in half. I walked into the home office. It was the room where we had spent nights arguing about seating charts and font choices. It was where the save the dates were licked and stamped. Now it was just a room with a desk and a laptop. I began to unplug the computer, wrapping the cords neatly. Sophie leaned against the doorframe, her arms crossed over her chest. I could feel her willing me to look at her. She wanted me to engage. She wanted me to ask her why she did it, to give her the chance to explain that she didn't mean it, that it was just a test to see how much I cared. But I didn't ask. I didn't care about the answer anymore. The action had spoken louder than any explanation could. The memory of the text message flashed in my mind again. I need to know you'll fight for me. It was such a cruel irony. I was fighting. I was fighting for my self-respect. I was fighting to extract myself from a dynamic where my commitment was treated as a toy to be tested. Real love isn't a game of chicken. Real love isn't about creating artificial crisis points to validate affection. Real love is boring. Real love is paying the mortgage and buying groceries and trusting that the person next to you will be there when you wake up. She had rejected real love for a fantasy of dramatic romance. And in doing so, she had destroyed the reality we had built. I finished packing the office and moved to the hallway. The boxes were stacked high, a fortress of my solitude. I walked past her without making eye contact, heading to the kitchen to pack the last of my essentials. She finally moved, blocking my path at the doorway to the living room. She stood there, tears welling in her eyes, her lower lip trembling. It was a performance, one she had used many times before when she wanted to get her way. Usually it worked. Usually, I would pull her into a hug and tell her it was okay. But as I looked at her, I felt nothing. No pull, no desire to comfort, no urge to fix it. I realized that the love hadn't died in the last 3 days. It had been eroding over the last 3 years, chipped away by small moments of selfishness and insecurity that I had chosen to ignore. The wedding cancellation was just the final crack in the dam. I stepped around her, careful not to touch her, and continued packing. The avoidance of physical contact was the loudest scream in the silent room. The sun was beginning to set, casting long, orange shadows across the floor of the half-empty living room. The movers were scheduled for the morning. I had hired them without telling her, another step in the logistics of my departure that she hadn't anticipated. I sat on the floor, leaning back against the sofa, drinking a glass of water, watching the dust motes dance in the light. Sophie was sitting on the armchair, her knees pulled up to her chest, watching me. The anger had given way to a raw, desperate panic. She was realizing that the script she had written for this week had been tossed into the fire, and she didn't know how to improvise. She started to move around the room, picking up random objects, a framed photo of us from a trip to Paris, a coffee mug I had bought her, a small souvenir from our first date. She was holding them up, offering them to me, trying to jog my memory, trying to trigger an emotional response through the power of nostalgia. It was pathetic, and it was heartbreaking, but mostly, it was infuriating. It felt like she was trying to buy my forgiveness with trinkets. She didn't understand that the issue wasn't the objects, it was the trust. She had taken the most solemn promise of my life and turned it into a psychological experiment. You don't come back from that. You don't unring that bell. I stood up and walked to the window. The street below was bustling with people going about their normal lives. It was a cruel reminder that the world kept turning even when your personal world had stopped. I looked at my reflection in the glass. I looked tired, but I looked strong. For the first time in years, I wasn't worried about making her happy. I wasn't worried about navigating her moods or anticipating her needs. I was just me. It was a terrifying isolation, but it was also exhilarating. The silence between us stretched, thick and uncomfortable. She was waiting for me to acknowledge the objects she was holding. She was waiting for me to crack. I turned away from the window. I walked over to the pile of boxes and picked up my wallet and keys. I put them in my pocket. The gesture was clear. I was leaving for the night. I wasn't going to sleep in the same house as her. I had a hotel booked down the street. A non-refundable room, of course. As I walked toward the door, she finally broke. She dropped the photo frame, the glass shattering on the hardwood floor. She didn't flinch at the sound. She looked at me, her eyes wide, realizing that I was actually walking out that door. She stepped forward, her hand reaching out to grab my arm, but she stopped inches from my sleeve. She could feel the invisible barrier I had erected. She saw the resolve in my posture. She realized that her test had resulted in a passing grade for me, but a failing one for us. I opened the door, stepped out into the hallway, and closed it gently behind me. I didn't look back. The click of the latch was the period at the end of the sentence. The hotel room was generic and impersonal, a beige box with a king-size bed and a view of the parking lot. It was perfect. I woke up the next morning to the sound of silence, not the hum of the espresso machine or the sound of Sophie in the shower. It was a jarring, peaceful silence. I checked my phone. There were dozens of missed calls and text messages from Sophie. They started with confusion and denial, then moved to anger, and then finally settled into desperate pleading. Please don't do this. I didn't mean it. I was just scared. Come home. The wedding is back on. I read them with a detached sense of curiosity. She was still trying to control the narrative, flipping the switch back on as if nothing had happened. She couldn't grasp that the power dynamic had shifted. She held the cards 3 days ago. She played them, and she lost. I met the movers at the apartment at 9 a.m. Sophie was there, sitting in the middle of the living room floor, surrounded by the boxes I had packed. She looked like a child lost in a department store. Her eyes were red and swollen. She hadn't slept. When I walked in with the movers, she scrambled to her feet, a mixture of relief and hope washing over her face. She thought I had come back. She thought the movers were there to move her out or maybe to move new furniture in. Her face fell when she watched the men start to load my boxes onto the hand truck. She tried to intercept them, asking them to stop, but they just looked at me for confirmation. I nodded to them, and they continued. She cornered me in the kitchen while the movers hauled away the furniture. She was shaking, her voice barely a whisper. She told me she made a mistake. She told me she was just stressed about the wedding and wanted reassurance. She said she loved me more than anything and that she would do anything to fix this. She asked me to call the guests, to uncancel the vendors, to put the suit back on. It was delusional. She thought we could just rewind the tape. I looked at her, really looked at her for the last time. I saw the woman I fell in love with, but I also saw the woman who was capable of inflicting deep emotional pain for an ego boost. I realized that if I took her back, if I forgave this, I would be setting the precedent for the rest of our marriage. Every time she felt insecure, every time she felt neglected, she would up the ante. The next test would be bigger, more destructive. I couldn't live like that. I didn't say a word. I didn't offer a monologue about why this was wrong. I didn't give her a speech about self-respect. I simply took the set of keys I had kept and placed them on the counter. Then, I took the envelope containing my half of the deposit for the condo and placed it next to the keys. It was a clean break, a financial transaction. She looked at the keys, then at me, and the realization finally hit her. It wasn't a bluff. I wasn't staying. I was gone. She collapsed onto the floor, sobbing, her head in her hands. It was a sound of pure, unadulterated grief. I felt a pang of sympathy, a ghost of the love I used to feel, but I stepped over it. I walked out the door, got into my car, and followed the moving truck to my new apartment. I didn't look in the rearview mirror. 6 months have passed since the wedding that never happened. The seasons have changed, the leaves have turned, and my life has settled into a rhythm that is entirely my own. I sit in my new living room, a space that is smaller than the condo I shared with Sophie, but it feels vast. It is filled with things I chose, arranged in a way that makes sense to me. There are no compromises on the thermostat. There are no arguments over what to watch on television. There is just peace. It took me a long time to adjust to the silence. Initially, it felt like an accusation, a reminder of my failure. But slowly, the silence became a comfort. It became a canvas upon which I could paint a new life. I heard through the grapevine that Sophie struggled for a long time after I left. She apparently fell into a deep depression, blaming herself, blaming her friends, blaming the toxic advice she had read online about keeping relationships exciting. She tried to reach out a few times in the months following the breakup, sending long emails apologizing for her behavior, promising she had changed, asking for a coffee date to catch up. I never replied. There was no point. The bridge had been burned, and the ashes had scattered. I didn't want a coffee date. I wanted a life free from the anxiety of her tests. I realized in the aftermath that her cancellation was the greatest gift she could have given me. It was a preemptive strike that saved me from a lifetime of walking on eggshells. It forced me to look in the mirror and ask myself what I wanted, not what we wanted. I learned that love is not a negotiation where you hold your own happiness hostage to see how much the other person cares. Love is a partnership of equals, not a game of emotional chicken played by a narcissist. Last week, I was walking through the park when I saw a familiar figure in the distance. It was Sophie. She was walking a dog I didn't recognize, holding hands with a man I had never seen. She looked happy, or at least, she looked like she was trying to be. I stopped for a second, watching them. A year ago, the sight would have gutted me. I would have felt a surge of jealousy and pain. But as I stood there, watching my past life unfold from a distance, I felt nothing but relief. I turned around and walked the other way, pulling my coat tighter against the chill wind. The air was crisp, the sky was blue, and for the first time in a long time, the future looked exactly like what I wanted it to be. I hadn't just walked away from a wedding. I had walked away from a test I didn't know I was taking, and somehow I had one. My name is Felix. I am 28 years old, and I am no longer someone's project to be fixed. I am finally free.